Hi, Stu Bamey coming to you from Pawleys Island, South Carolina. And we've been talking about what's going on at Harvard University and why it's important that nothing represents the very best of our higher education system than Harvard University. It is the gold standard, the very best of the best. That's why if there's a problem there at Harvard University, that problem will trickle down to every level of our educational system, all the way to grade school. It will affect every person and every kid in our country. Now, let me offer a disclaimer. I'm not talking, when I talk about Harvard University, about every person there, the faculty, the staff, the students. There are some wonderful people there. But the leadership has gone crazy. It has lost its way. It's living in the darkness. And I want to tell you why from God's perspective. I want to get below the surface and lay out for you, in simple terms, the struggle that's being waged for the very heart, the soul, the mind of our kids, and why it's important. I've reminded you of what Judges 21:25 says. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In Israel, the king represented God's authority. When there was no authority, no godly authority, no ultimate truth source, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, whatever they wanted. There was no absolute God, no absolute truth source, no absolute standards of right or wrong. Christianity counters that there is a God, that there are absolute truths, there is an absolute truth source, there are universal standards of right and wrong, of good and bad, for all people at all times, and that we are bound by these standards. Paul put it this way. In Romans 1:18, Paul writes these words, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." Notice what Paul says here. The wrath of God is revealed against the suppression of truth. This is a very, very, very powerful passage that Paul begins his whole doctrine of the understanding of all of the history of salvation in Romans with this teaching. The wrath of God. Wrath, in the Greek, it means the unbridled anger of God. That God's not just annoyed or irritated or bothered. He's furious. He's angry. And the question becomes, what is the reason for that anger? To which Paul is quick to tell us, because people suppress the truth about God. In that one single act, God's anger is provoked when we suppress the truth. The whole human race suppresses the truth about God. This is what Paul's saying. Suppress, in the Greek, to hinder, to stifle, to obscure, to repress, to get it out of our minds, to eliminate it from our lives. Eliminate that truth about God. Paul says that God makes distinctions between good and bad, right and wrong, light and dark, male and female, and that culture blurs those distinctions. It mixes them, it confuses them, that we want to take the place of God and determine our own value system, our own truth source. And when we do that, we suppress the truth. Now the question becomes, what is that truth that we are suppressing? To which Paul replies in Romans 1:19. Paul writes, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." You see what Paul is saying here? What may be known about God is plain because God has made it plain. God's made the knowledge of God plain to everyone. It's clearly known. Why is it so clearly known? Why is it so plain? Because God is the teacher. We can't say we didn't learn because we have a bad teacher. The teacher is God, and he's a good teacher, and he teaches everyone, and his teaching gets through to everyone. The atheist who believes that there is no God without God, atheist without God, and the agnostic, a form of atheism that says there's not sufficient knowledge to know about God, those two are refuted here by what Paul is saying. The atheist and the agnostic refuse to acknowledge God, and they blame God, but God can't be blamed. We can't say that he hasn't done a good job of revealing himself. Paul says the problem began at the day of creation, this problem with God himself. At the beginning of time, The problem is we're at enmity with God, at hostility with God. We don't want God to exist. It's not just an intellectual problem, it is an emotional problem. Paul says that nature, the world, reveal the invisible qualities of God. That is, his eternal power. Paul spells this out. He's omnipotent, he's self-existent. And his divine nature, his omniscience, his holiness, his righteousness, his sovereignty, they are clearly seen from what's been made to everyone, every person, everywhere, throughout all of time. This knowledge of God is not obscure, it's not hidden, it's not buried. Every human being knows that God exists, the God of the Bible, that God exists. All people, all times, the whole human race, because God has revealed himself in nature. We've been through this with the arguments for the existence of God through design and through origin and through being, that nature does reveal that there's a complex designer for a complex design. So the condemnation Paul is speaking about here is not about the suppression of Scripture. He's not talking about the rejection of Jesus. He's talking about a truth that we have rejected, that we can know outside of the Bible and outside of Jesus. And that truth is that every human being knows that God, the God of the Bible, exists. He's made himself clearly known to all people at all times. Again, the whole human race. Catch this. God doesn't condemn us for rejecting Jesus. He condemns us for rejecting him, for his existence, which is clearly revealed in all that exists. Now, this rejection of God leaves us without excuse. We're toast. There's universal revelation of God's existence to all people. There's the universal rejection of God's existence by all people. And this leads to the universal condemnation of all people by God. You know, when you get a speeding ticket, you appear before the judge and you plead not guilty. I didn't see the signs. I didn't know the speed limit. I'm innocent. I'm not guilty. And you know what the judge says. He said, if you're driving, you're responsible. The signs were posted by the police department. There is no excuse. You are guilty as charged. And that's the same with God. God's revealed himself, put up the signs, guilty as charged. Well, you say, well, what about the poor innocent native in Africa who's never heard about Jesus? Well, there is no innocent native in Africa. God doesn't condemn people for rejecting Jesus. Here Paul's saying God is condemning people for rejecting him, for his existence. Even if they've never heard of Jesus, they are still guilty. They have rejected the existence of the God of the Bible. There is no one who is innocent. No, not one. We are without excuse. God has revealed his existence to all people at all times in the natural world, in the created order. And all people have rejected this revelation. So God says, we are without excuse. All of us have rejected him. I know we tend to assume, well, if I haven't heard the story of Jesus, I must be innocent. But Jesus comes into the world and says, you've already rejected God. You're not innocent. You're without excuse. That's why I've come, to save you from the condemnation of rejecting the existence of God. For understanding, once you reject that existence of God, for understanding that you've failed God, you've broken relationship with him. It's not that there isn't enough evidence or that the evidence for the existence of God is unclear or inadequate. It's simply that we've rejected the truth of God's existence. So we are without excuse. So that begs the question, what is the result for rejecting God, the God who exists? Let's wrap this up. Paul writes in Romans 1:21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. What's the result? Your thinking becomes futile, your hearts get darkened, you become fools. Although they knew God, in the Greek gnosko, they knew God. They knew God intellectually, emotionally, relationally. But they rejected God, suppressed the truth of God, refused to glorify Him or honor Him or give thanks to Him as God. And when we did this, our thinking became futile. Our minds go blank. They get lost. We don't want to hear about God. Our foolish hearts, they get darkened. The mind goes blank, the heart gets darkened. You can't see. There's no light. We're blind. Claiming to be wise, skilled, smartest, the brightest, the very best of the best, we become fools. In the Greek, silly, dumb, stupid. We trade in what's true and good for what's false and dark. Claiming to be wise, we become fools. Isn't it interesting that some of the most brilliant people who've ever lived with gigantic intellects have become just fools? I think of Stephen Hawking, who's turned enormous amounts of people away from a belief in God. He's ignored the truths that are plainly known. He's not seeking after truth. He's not brilliant. He's not misled. He's ignorant. He's foolish. I'm not saying he's not a good man, but his thinking is foolish. It's ignorant. David Hume, Kant, Sartre, Camus, Nietzsche. Nietzsche finally said, all of that great thinking of all these great people, ultimately I'm driven to nihilism, to life has no meaning, that God's irrelevant. And when we say God is irrelevant, Paul says we become fools. We live our lives in the dark. How could such brilliant people end up so far from the truth? It's easy. They reject what's clearly revealed. It's easy. There's no king in the land. We don't want any absolute authorities. Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And it's this kind of thinking, this kind of ideology that's prevailed at a place like Harvard University and trickled down to every area of our lives, every kid, every person in our culture. We have drifted so far from the Harvard seal of 1636, from John Harvard donating his library to the school in 1638, because theology, God, ology, the study of God was the starting point of the founders of Harvard University, was the starting point of all knowledge. You see, in God's world, all true science, all true knowledge, all true reason ends up with God. In every area of life, God is the author of all things. And to exclude God is not science, it's not reason, it's foolishness, it's darkness. And this foolishness trickles itself down to every level of our culture. As I've been saying, it's a slippery slope. The sled gets on the hill at the top of the mountain and slowly starts down the slope, and it gets faster and faster and faster, and then finally there are no brakes. It can't stop itself. The momentum is too great. That's where we are today. That's why what's happening at Harvard University is shining a light on the state of the whole American educational system, of our culture, and where we find ourselves today. It's darkened, it's foolish, and ultimately, by God, whether we choose to believe it or not, it's condemned, which leaves us lost and divided. That's why the way back, the only way back, is for the leadership of Harvard University, which represents the very best of the best, the gold standard, for our educational system, for our people, for our culture, for our country, to return to its roots, to our foundations, to our very beginning, in the case of Harvard, to its seal and what that meant. To return back to a Christian world view. There is a God. He has revealed himself to all people at all times. There is an absolute truth source. There are absolute standards of right and wrong. We have to return back to the basics, and that's why Harvard represents what's taking place in our culture. There is no other way than to return back to our beginnings, to our roots, to our foundation, to our Christian worldview. And we need to pray into that and act into that and get involved in every way we possibly can in saying, this is the way back. Awaken, return, come back to the knowledge, of the existence of the God of the Bible as the beginning and the starting point of all truth.